Well, hello everybody, and welcome again to another OpenShift Commons briefing. Today we have Derek Carr and Mike Barrett from the OpenShift engineering and product management teams, and they're going to give us a briefing on the latest release of OpenShift Origin. And I'll let them introduce themselves and get started because there's a lot of information in this package today. So take it away, Mike, and let's get a move on it here.
Great, thanks, Diane. So I'm going to be covering what's in Origin 3.10, and a lot of you have already had access to this code, depending on where you're pulling your Origin from. As you know, you can pull straight from the head, where you get builds every night, or you can just use the milestone on the release pages. A couple of weeks ago, we did release another milestone. I think we labeled it RC0, so a lot of these features you've had in your hands for a couple of weeks now. We will typically, when we release the downstream version, the one that we sell over the counter, we cut another milestone release. So you will probably see another Origin milestone release next week at some point. That is when this will actually ship next week, probably around Thursday. We try to give customers guidance on, well, what was the big purpose of this release? It was really to make the cluster more efficient. When you look at a cluster that's been up for a long time, there's care and feeding that you have to perform on it. There's higher levels of security options that people will typically want. How you add resources to the cluster has become much more efficient, and then how that the workload diversity and how that workload touches and consumes storage CPU and memory. We've given you some better hooks in those areas. So it's really just a more efficient release for us in terms of the cluster itself, a distributed system, using the resources that are available to it. The first area that has some subtle changes, more on the back end, not something that's necessarily going to be seen in your users, is our automation broker. We pretty much just have the Ansible implementation of the automation broker. If you haven't seen this concept, check it out. When you deal with the open service broker and service brokers in general in our industry, typically you get a service broker for every single service that you run. This takes us a step back and still uses the same APIs, but says, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to load another service broker for every single service? And allows you to just load just the one service broker and represent lots of services in it. So this has a subtle change on the back end. We moved to using the CRD API instead of using the local etcd instance. We give you some more information about who is provisioning the services, so that comes out, and then we give you more robust error messages coming back, which is easier to troubleshoot when things don't happen. There we go. Another thing to mention that not a lot of people are aware of, a lot of the cloud providers do have service brokers at this point. And AWS was the first mover by far in this area for the OpenShift platform. So it has the most services available to it. If you have not seen this in your Origin install, please do check it out. It's very simple to turn on and to load. It brings in, I think, over 25 AWS services into your service console in Origin at this point. So you'd be able to very rapidly start seeing what an application might look like if you merged it both on-premise, consuming these off-premise services. The user interface, our console, our web console, we've been constantly improving it. Hopefully you've enjoyed those improvements and the new look and feel. This time around, we're fixing an improved search of that catalog, since the catalog is getting so much more, even off-service and in-service services in it. We really did need to buckle down on how you're able to pull things up. And so, tab completion, the waiting based on what you've typed already, a lot of those features are starting to come in with this release. The route, so this was a new feature back, I think, in 3.7, could have been 3.9, but we gave the ability for a user to have multiple routes to their application, but we didn't expose it in the user interface. Now you do have that option to turn it on in the user interface, and then you'd be able to see the multiple routes to that application. Generic secrets. So if you ever clicked on our resource tab, we have a lot of resources under there, right? You can work with your config maps. You can work with a lot of the things that don't have a view in the overview or in the applications tabs. So that you have a lot of ability to edit things on the fly here under the resources tab. We've added an ability to have generic secrets. This gives you the opaque secret that you're able to consume, and the user will be able to attach to their services and workloads that they're deploying on the platform. Service catalog. It does have a command line. Not a lot of people know about the command line. We bring that into the fold in the 3.10 release, so you can be successful adding stuff that is, through any of the service brokers that we have through this one command. So the service brokers, right? We talked about the Ansible one, but there's also the template service broker. There's the AWS service broker. There's probably, I think, up to 8 of them right now, and it's one command line that would help you work through the usage of content through all of them. And just ends and odds here. When we did give you the generic secret management, we did fix the add remove change. So you do have the lifecycle ability in that user interface to work with the secrets. And some of the error messages, we talked about it for the Ansible service broker, but also as we provision and work with deployment configs, we did fix some error messages that were coming out in that area of the product. Jenkins. I don't know if anybody's using the pipeline feature in the product. It really gives you a quick onboard to deploying Jenkins on Kubernetes and consuming it in a dynamic fashion. We were leaving some old build jobs out there on the Jenkins farm. This release fixes that. It allows you to reap them and bring them back in and remove them. So a lot of improvements in those areas. And then we update our build agent, the slave images, to understand the Node.js that's coming from our Roar package, which is the higher versions of Node, like 10 and 8, and then also have an understanding of Maven. The CDK and the Minishift, I don't know if anybody is experienced this yet. Again, here, I'd definitely encourage you to take a look at it. It allows you to run isolated on your laptop, have a fully functional cluster. This obviously updates to understand Origin 3.10 in this release cycle. They actually released that this week, a week before the big milestone pushes. So it'll sit idle for a week, the feature, until we release the binaries, but that is there for you to take advantage of. Operator. So we pushed this out to the GitHubs back in Copenhagen at KubeCon. So there's a lot of information out there right now on the Operator SDK. Definitely encourage any Kubernetes distribution to be taking advantage of this. When you look at it, some of the awesome improvements are around the packaging, the front end of your operators. When you take a step back, there's a lot of options there. We're championing Helm charts for the operators and also Ansible playbook bundles. And then you can also obviously just do the straight Go code, which is what the operator is based on. So a lot of awesome choices on how you package your content for the operator that you've just written are available in that SDK. And with that, did Derek happen to join yet?
Yeah, Mike, I'm here. Sorry about my technical difficulties.
No problem.
Yep.
Just
So
tell me next slide when you want to move it.
sure thing. With each release of OpenShift comes a rev version of the underlying container orchestration engine provided by Kubernetes. So in a prior comments briefing, we had described some of the major highlights that came out of the Kubernetes 1.10 release. Encourage folks to follow that if they want to refresh their memory, but we want to go through a series of particular issues or enhancements that came in the release that we're going to highlight here. On the right-hand side, though, I just want to make clear that people understand that OpenShift engineers are largely working upstream in the Kubernetes community to drive these changes forward. And so we're always excited then when we can get them out into the OpenShift ecosystem during this actual release. So that, if you want to move to the next slide, we'll start going on particular detailed features. So there's been a long effort ongoing in the Kubernetes community broadly to support a wider variety of workloads on the cluster, as well as a wider variety of platforms. So within the 3.10 release, you're going to see enhancements in these two areas. So there were three major features around bringing on more workload types that were added in the release, a huge pages feature, CPU management, and device manager. So quickly on each, the device manager, people were welcome to go talk about that afterwards, but this is a general framework where you can encourage device plugin vendors to make their devices knowable by the cluster and scheduled by the cluster and then consumed by applications. So the canonical example you'll often hear in the community around this area is GPUs, but we're excited to see what the broader ecosystem does with the device plugin support over time. Two other particular features we'll talk about here are the CPU manager and huge pages. So a lot of folks might not be familiar with what it means when you actually schedule a pod to have a particular amount of CPU on the cluster, but traditionally your pod gets bound to a particular node. The node then tells the container engine to run that workload, and the container engine interacts with some kernel primitives called the complete fair scheduler, and it basically allocates CPU time, but that CPU time might be shared across multiple CPUs on your machine. So particular sets of applications are often sensitive to being moved across CPU cores. So the CPU manager feature is meant to address those application types. So if you're very latency sensitive around management of CPU related resources, this is a feature that could be up your alley. It's pretty simple to enable. You, on your node configuration for the nodes that are running this class of workload, you turn on the CPU manager feature gate like you see on the right. You set the policy to static, and basically any pod that gets landed on that node that makes a whole integral CPU request and is in the guaranteed quality service tier is going to get guaranteed an exclusive CPU core for the life of its workload. So as I said, this is a useful feature for many latency sensitive workloads that are looking to onboard onto Kubernetes and OpenShift generally, and excited to see how this feature evolves over time. The other major area around workload expansions are on huge pages. So similarly, this is a pretty easy feature to interact with. The feature gate for huge pages is actually on by default, but just to enumerate here that when the flag is on, pod specs can now request huge pages in the same way that they would request CPU or memory resources. So given that huge pages, the page size varies by architecture, there's a unique naming constraint around how you identify the size of huge pages you want to consume. But in this case, you'll see on the example on the right, you're asking for just 100 megabits of 2 megabyte huge pages. If the node had pre-allocated huge pages configured, the node will expose it up to the scheduler. The kubelet will properly isolate them. Your application can consume them. And the scheduler will know how to schedule resources to those nodes properly. So huge pages can be consumed either as empty dir volumes or directly in your application outside of volume. So this would be useful for applications that are running large caches, very large JVMs, and has often been an impediment to getting that type of workload on the cluster. So next slide. So another interesting feature on the node side is a feature called the node problem detector. This is an optional capability that you can deploy to your cluster. It runs as a daemon set and deploys a pod onto each node in your cluster that kind of acts as a babysitter to help augment what the kubelet can see by default for node problems with some additional capabilities. And when it sees a problem, in many cases, it's just monitoring kernel logs via journal D, and can be configured with a set of regex patterns to identify certain issues, like if the kernel is actually hung. And if it identifies one of these issues, it will reflect that as a condition on the node object itself. So it gets broader visibility to the cluster, and then monitoring agents or node admins can better understand what's going on with their machines and how to then remedy the problem. So this is a component that is currently tech preview. We expect it to GA in the near term, and we think in the fullness of time, this will help surface more and more node issues to support auto remediation concepts in the future. So interesting building block moving forward. Next slide. Yep, so this is another feature here in Kubernetes 1.10 that we're getting in OpenShift 3.10 here is around protection of local ephemeral storage. So many folks know Kubernetes can schedule CPU and memory. We discussed how new in this release it can also schedule huge pages. But another major item that had been missing that is now available is the ability to schedule ephemeral storage. So when we describe ephemeral storage, it's important to distinguish this from persistent storage. Ephemeral storage basically is the disk on which your pod writes logs, any empty dir volumes that your pod consumes, or the actual copy on write layer for your containers that your application might be working against. So in the past, this was treated as like a best effort resource. So the node actually has some capability to observe when ephemeral storage is running low, and it would have evicted pods to try to reclaim that space. But now the actual node is able to report back how much ephemeral storage it has, how much, and then as a consequence, pods can start to request particular amounts. And then the scheduler can schedule it out. So now we can actually make it that management of the actual local disk is being managed just like CPU and memory resources. So the feature currently is tech preview. It can be enabled by turning on a set of feature gates here. We encourage everyone to try it out and help direct us for how we can continue to drive improvements in this area in the upstream. But we think in the fullness of time, this is a really killer feature. So next slide. So the other component that comes in tech preview as well is the descheduler component. This is an interesting component in that if you imagine when a pod is first scheduled, the scheduler looks at the current state of the cluster and tries to find a node that can best meet the needs of that workload. But given the nature of the cluster and you're in a dynamic and fluid system, what was once an optimal scheduling decision, maybe weeks later, months later, even days or hours later, not be as optimal as it could be moving forward. So if you think of the descheduler component, think of it as like a defragmenter for your OpenShift cluster. It runs as a job on the cluster in the Kube system project, and it can be configured with a set of available policies for how you want the descheduler to operate. And so in the interest of time, I encourage folks to look at the review of the set of policies on the right, but they can help you balance actual utilization of workloads across your clusters, as well as help continue to enforce that you get good availability constraints. So for example, if you had a replica set that required 3 replicas and 2 out of those 3 were on the same node, but space becomes available later on another node, so you could fully spread those out. A common use case for this scheduler there would to remove those duplicates and rebalance your workloads across the full state of current compute. So interesting capability. We expect this to grow over time as more and more defragmenting needs will be needed on the next slide. So in addition to the performance-oriented features you heard earlier around bringing more and more workloads onto the cluster, the other major capability that's in dev preview in this release is supporting additional platforms themselves. So in this case, Windows container support is a feature we continue to help drive in the upstream and look forward to bring out to everybody now within OpenShift Origin. There are some prerequisites in place on the particular versions of Windows Server you need to get to join the OpenShift cluster, but I encourage people who are looking at running Windows workloads or wanting to manage them to take a look at this, join the developer program preview, and look at the actual video of it working to see more details here. With that, next slide. So going through some other additional features here, it's been a common theme that we're trying to make more and more the actual resources that run on the cluster report metrics and then ultimately be discoverable via Prometheus and alerted against. So the registry component now that runs on the cluster can be servicing its metrics and also ensure that those metrics are protected by a authentication endpoint. And this is just a stepping stone to ensuring that everything that is scraped by the cluster monitoring Prometheus solutions in the future are securely trusted behind authentication. So next slide. The major topic I want to spend a little bit of time on here, and tell Mike if you jumped the slide, I think you did, is changes to how people will see the deployment topology for OpenShift itself in 3.10. So prior to the 3.10 release, the control plane ran as a set of systemd managed units on the masters when running on RHEL. And if you were running on Atomic Host, they were running as a series of system containers. What we're trying to do is consolidate the way that we manage the control plane, whether on RHEL or a containerized Linux environment, by bringing more and more of the cluster components under the management of the cluster itself. So in 3.10, you'll see a major change for how the actual deployments are, how the actual control plane components are deployed. So etcd, the API server, and controller manager are all now running as static pods, which means the kubelet itself running on your masters is responsible for ensuring that those pods stay running. This has a number of benefits. First benefit being primarily that you can actually introspect and debug and view the logs of these critical control plane components just like any other application component on the cluster. So if you navigate to the namespace that's running these pods, you can do the normal commands to view logs, exec-in, and do debugging capabilities. The upgrade process between 3.9 and 3.10 handles this behind the scenes for you. But for us, this looks as a critical key stepping stone to getting more and more of the actual management of the cluster being under the cluster's visibility by default. Next slide. So there were also significant changes in the 3.10 release around how nodes are configured. So in the past, people may have been familiar with the node config YAML file that we had that you would edit, and then Ansible would push out into each individual compute node in your cluster. And then when the node agent would start up, it would read that config and locally know how to run the node agent. A change here in this release is that we have a feature called Bootstrap Node Configuration, and this makes all of the actual node configuration now managed as API objects in the cluster itself, so that you can make a change to a set of nodes in an entire group and have that be pushed out to all nodes that match that group centrally. So what you'll see in 3.10 is that for each node group type, there is a config map created and managed within the cluster that actually holds your node config YAML definition. If you want to make changes to how your nodes are configured, you edit that file directly in the cluster, just like any other config map. And there's actually an agent now running as a daemon set on every node that will see that change, bring that change down to your local machine, and restart the kubelet to make that new configuration take effect. So basically now all management of your nodes and how they're configured can be handled centrally within the cluster. The upgrade process ensures that your nodes are properly grouped and the proper config maps are set up. But basically, now in 3.10, no operator or admin should go direct to the node to make a change for how the node operates, but instead should be thinking about nodes in terms of groups and making that change centrally within the cluster. In the fullness of time, also another major feature of this and why this is important is that the way nodes join a cluster has changed. So a node is given an initial bootstrapping config that gives it enough information to phone home to the API server to say, hey, this is who I am, and this is, I want to join the cluster. And it can do that securely. And then the API server now knows how to then deliver your configuration down to the node based on one of these config maps in your cluster. So in the fullness of time, we expect to continue to iterate on the solution and align it with other features that people may have seen in the Kubernetes upstream that we're continuing to iterate and evolve around dynamic kubelet configuration. But again, more and more our intent is to get more and more of this stuff under management of the cluster itself. So next slide. So on the networking side, when pods want to be able to speak to services off cluster, you could run an egress router. There were some changes in the 3.10 release to ensure that you had an HA configuration so that if your egress endpoint went out, that it could gracefully fail over to an alternative setup. So folks who are interested in having their pods communicate to off-cluster services, I encourage people to check this out and look at more details. Next slide. Additionally, an additional enhancement around egress routers was around the ability to not just contact your endpoint by IP address, but also DNS name. So again, if you're having your pods work on services that are off cluster, this is a compelling feature for folks to check out. Next slide. So I guess a common request that we would hear is about what to do when your actual service network has to expand. So we do have a documented prescripted procedure to follow about how you can expand the size of your network. Mike gracefully has thrown the 5 steps here on the right, but in general, this is a general procedure on how you can improve management of your network over time. But for folks who have this need or issue or concern, recommend folks checking out that process. Next slide. On the security front, it's very important that we continue to harden the security of the cluster. For communication to etcd, users now have the ability to whitelist a set of cipher suites that are conformant to the organizational needs. There are some flags you can configure etcd with to control the actual cipher suite behavior. But I encourage folks who are interested on ensuring that the communication to and from etcd is meeting their security needs to check this out, and hopefully it will address any concerns. Next slide. On the security front as well, another tech preview feature that we want to call out is the ability for containers within a pod to share the PID namespace. So this is a feature that's been under work for a while in the upstream community, largely around improving the debuggability of containers. But for folks who are building particular classes of applications who's running multiple containers in their pod spec where they want to be able to do some type of inter-process communication and share that process namespace, this is a tech preview feature. You can enable the feature gate on the nodes in question where you need this capability, and basically your containers can see each other within the pod. There are some caveats that I want to call out the walkthrough, but in the interest of time, we can move on and people can check that out. Next slide. Yep, so another hardening feature on the security front is that the router service account that controls ingress into the cluster no longer needs access to the secrets for all secrets on the cluster. This is just a best practicing hardening capability that you'll now see in the default deployments for 3.10, which ensures that a compromise of your router doesn't necessarily compromise your entire cluster. Next slide. Many folks have heard the concept in the upstream Kubernetes community around the container storage interface, also called CSI, that was discussed during the Kubernetes 1.10 webinar. But in OpenShift 3.10, we're offering this capability as a dev preview environment. So if there are particular users who are interested in interfacing with the container storage interface for their storage subsystems, we encourage everyone to check it out and provide their feedback to the team, both in the OpenShift and upstream. Next slide. Each release, there's further enhancements in the storage space around particular storage provisioners. So new in this release is the capability for Ceph. And so if folks are looking to integrate their OpenShift environments with Ceph, this would be a thing we encourage everyone to check out. Again, it's tech preview for the release. Slide. Finally, OpenShift runs on Rails, so we wanted to call out a couple of the key highlights for Rails 7.5, as well as make everyone aware of particular issues I'll call out. On this particular slide in particular, what I'm interested in calling out is ensuring that everyone understands that overlay.fs is now the default storage driver for container runtimes, which means it's now the default storage driver for OpenShift installs as well. Device Mapper continues to be supported and available, but we encourage everyone to move over to overlay.fs as long as they are not vulnerable to any particular edge cases around POSIX compliance. With that, I think we can move on to the next slide. With the OpenShift 3.10 release comes a release of the CRI-O v1.10. So as folks are aware, innovation in the container runtime space has been a long-going effort in the upstream Kubernetes community. At Red Hat, we've put significant energy around the CRI-O effort, which is an OCI-compliant implementation for a Kubernetes container runtime interface dedicated solely to Kubernetes. CRI-O in v1.10 continues to work, is fully supported, and meets all the conformance needs to running your OpenShift and Kubernetes clusters. Improvements in this release include the CRI-CTL CLI is now available, which lets you debug your clusters, whether they're running Docker as the container engine or they're running CRI-O as the container engine, using a common CLI tool, which just speaks to the container runtime interface itself. At this time, the installer can allow you to install a fresh cluster using CRI-O when configured appropriately, and we encourage folks to check out CRI-O and provide more feedback on the runtime so we continue to improve and iterate. We're seeing ourselves excellent performance when running CRI-O, so we are running it ourselves in production in our OpenShift starter environments, and in general finding it to be a pleasant operational experience. With that, next slide. And with that, I guess it's wrapped up. We can take any questions.
I think I've answered a lot of them. Let's see if I missed any.
Maybe just reiterating what the difference between dev preview and tech preview is might be a good thing to get recorded here. I've done a good answer.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of dev preview and tech preview, dev preview is normally, we'll be using upstream bits. You know, we might ask you to pull from GitHub or even from locations from other open source communities that aren't from Red Hat. We're typically form a program around it because we don't want to tax, you know, critical support services. So, you know, it'll be very specific people that would have knowledge about talking to you on that. If you're in a program, you're giving us updates weekly. And we don't know when the GA date is typically going to be for a dev preview, right? It's so early on in the development cycle that we don't know when certain milestones would be. We're just trying to solicit feedback at this very, very beginning period. Tech previews normally past that stage, right? And we know exactly what we want to deliver. We know there's a market for it. We'll put it out. You still won't be able to get break fix support, but the support services will still know what you're talking about when you call. You'll still not be able to upgrade. We'll make you reinstall a tech preview feature for the GA version of it. So it's not backwards compatible in that regard. And more importantly, we can forecast the GA date at that point. So that's the primary difference between the two.
And one, it was a big thing, I think, as well. There's a question around Atomic will be depreciated in favor of CoreOS Atomic merge. And will that be backward compatible? And is the CoreOS option available today? I think there's a lot of meat in this presentation, but I think that was one of the bigger things. Can you address that?
Yeah, and so in terms of the container Linux, at Summit, we really, if you haven't seen a lot of those decks, they go to a pretty deep analysis of what we're pulling from container Linux and what we're pulling from Atomic Project, and now that's going to become Red Hat CoreOS. So you won't hear us use the words container Linux or Atomic Host. We'll use the word Red Hat CoreOS, and that means the just enough operating system that is accelerated for container usage. backwards compatible is an interesting thing. I mean, it's a brand new install, right? Brand new kernel that you would install. It isn't in that regard backwards compatible. We did keep a lot of the smaller sub projects in the container Linux upstream, like Ignition, for example. We're carrying that forward. So where we carry things forward, you'll still see them obviously in that new release. Can you get your hands on it now? So what we're doing is that the container Linux in the atomic host obviously had larger communities than just this community, right? And just the orchestrators community, the Tectonic in CoreOS's case, or OpenShift in our case. As we merge them together, we do have to put a priority on one just to get something out. So we are releasing it through OpenShift first, right? So this new Red Hat CoreOS will be available through Origin, through the OpenShift communities first, and that'll take you into 2018 and probably the first quarter of 2019. As we get into closer to the middle of 2019, that's when we will have the ability to, just for the general use cases outside of OpenShift, that's when you'll start being able to download it and use it as a standalone. Any other questions? So is Hakadia moved to 7 for cluster storage? I'm not that close where I know the versions of Gluster, but we can take that as an action item to get back to you, Mark.
There's one last question there around the web UI for administrators, where you can manage PVs, nodes, and et cetera from the web interface. Is that coming in 3.10? We covered that off at the very beginning.
So there's no changes in the PVs. The only thing happening in the storage world around usability is in this release, and if you're into CNS, the container native storage, that release pumps a lot more usage data and event data into Prometheus. So that's the only usability change that I have coming in the PV area. In terms of the operator experience in the web user interface, so the the ability to see more raw Kubernetes, that comes in 3.11. So in 3.11, we're taking a lot of the Tectonic consoles and we're making them available as a GA user experience in OpenShift, and then that'll be 2 consoles, if you will, that you'll pick the experience that you want. And then in the release after that, they'll merge into the same code base, and they'll be both on a React backend and a single web console.
And there was one question earlier that you mentioned and answered in the chat, Mike, around Helm, and that it was possible to run Helm today on any kube cluster, but that we don't encourage it for multi-tenant clusters. And really emphasizing that starting in 3.11, when we get the operator service broker, you'll start to be able to see the ability to use Helm for operators. And I just wanted to add in, if anyone's interested in learning more about the operator framework, the operator SDK, operators in general, there is going to be a reoccurring, I think, 3rd Friday of every month, operator framework SIG. The first one is going to be this week, Friday at 9 a.m., and I've posted the details in the chat for how you get there. And there will be a good intro talk with members of the team working on the operator framework and driven by Sebastian Paul, and a number of other folks are going to be joining on. So there's really good content around operators coming up in the next little while. So I encourage you to join that. Derek, is there anything else that you wanted to highlight?
I just want to make sure we got through all the questions, so I'm trying to scroll from the top down.
And I will try and set up an Istio tech preview that's coming soon as well. So this next week is the tech preview for the 3.10 code base. So look for that in the coming announcements. Getting pretty busy, but I'll try and squeeze one in next week or the week after.
Just any other questions I see here? So does Prometheus replace Hawkular in this release? No, it doesn't. Hocular will actually be in 3.11 as well, and then we will completely remove it from the product in the release after 3.11. We did release a Z-Stream for 3.9, I think today or yesterday, so that's why you saw the .33 come out. That's fine to upgrade to 3.10. 3.10 should be available next week by Thursday is when I would be forecasting it. Any improvements around AWS and autoscale groups, that comes in our 3.11 release. So the what you saw Derek presenting about TLS bootstrapping nodes in, that was a huge feature to get in to enable the auto scaling feature to be fully capable. So we're just cleaning that up, and that'll be available in 3.11. I'm sure, Diane, there's a request for a session on CSI. CSI is getting to the point where I think partners would be interested, not really end users, but people who distribute storage solutions to the market. I think CSI right now is at the Kube 1.10 and higher level is probably something you should start paying attention to. For end users, it's pretty not too exciting.
No, it all depends on your point of view. I think, well, we've got a whole bunch of little questions coming in now. Any plans to support Heptio Arc?
It is a project we're looking at pretty closely. They also have, was it Sonia Bui or something like that? So we're definitely investigating whether or not we should start including it. No decision so far on it. So
I think we've done a pretty good job, and that's about 45 minutes there. If you have more questions, people will be in the Slack channel afterwards. If you're not in Slack yet, ping me at dmueller@redhat.com, and I'll add you in. I'm also very interested in knowing if you are running Origin deployments in production too, with the Origin release. Anyone who which one of you are actually running Origin, that would be much appreciated too. So revamping our Origin website and some more information about who's using it and how you're using that site would be very helpful. Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you, Mike and Derek, for taking the time today, as you do each release. Much appreciated. Lots of content in there, so we're going to try and get a number of briefings, deeper dives into different topics. So look for those coming out in the coming weeks and months. All right. Take care all, and looking forward to getting more feedback from you all.